Well, what to make of Anthony Albanese's sweeping election victory? Well, to understand its true significance, let's revisit an opinion poll before the election was called. 83% of Australians support more government spending to help with the cost of living pressures. Only 12% disagreed. No wonder Labor pledged to spend big during the election, and of course the opposition joined in the spendathon. But the party of Howard and Costello was never going to outspend the party of Whitlam. Australians recognise that. After all, the public is reeling from the worst costs of living crisis in generations, and they're turned off by the Trump disruption. Now, at first glance, the public's support for more government financial support and more government spending to assist with cost of living pressures, it's understandable. When household budgets are tight, people look to government for security. And remember, Australia is experiencing the longest decline in real household incomes in living memory. But this is the cold hard reality. Ultimately, more government spending will drive up deficits, debt and taxation, and put pressure on inflation to rise. Inflation, taken together with the resulting rising interest rates, will just tighten cost of living pressures again. And more government spending will not address our nation's number one economic problem, our nation's productivity drought. It may even make that problem worse. Now, if Australia had an ideal election contest in April, the parties would have debated how the nation can pay its way and reduce energy and housing costs through less regulation. Instead, all the argument was about how to spend and regulate more. There was no recognition of constraints or trade-offs. Now, many Australians, especially millennials and Gen Z, they believe that high levels of government spending and regulation are justified to address their dwindling lot in life. But that would just sap incentive and undermine the private sector investment that must occur if productivity growth is to be revived. Unless mining and commodity price booms keep rolling in, which we should not count on, by the way, the productivity problem means weak economic growth, little or no advance in real wages, less tax revenue to pay for the services people say they want, and an increased vulnerability to inflation. And with weaker tax revenues, how do we pay for important government programs? The National Disability Insurance Scheme, childcare, aged care, public hospitals, education. All these programs are worthy, but as a percentage of GDP, the costs are growing at alarming levels. The result, as my colleague Robert Carling points out, is a growing disconnect between the rising costs of the care economy and a reduced ability to finance them. And that's not to mention the interest on public debt and the very real threat to Australia's AAA credit rating. And it's also not to mention defence spending, which has also risen as a percentage of GDP and is set to rise further. Now, what's going on here is pretty clear. Since the global financial crisis, both sides of politics have indulged in the complacency of prosperity thanks to the China-fueled development resources boom. At the same time, unfunded spending programs remain unsustainable, and both Labor and coalition governments have shied away from embracing the kind of productivity agenda that provided the foundation for our nation's long prosperity from the early 1990s to the financial crisis of 2008-2009. As the Australian Financial Review's Michael Stutchbury says, quote, "Australia's resources wealth has underwritten an entitlement culture that Labor feeds and the coalition is too timid or powerless to resist." Now, Australia does face an uncertain economic global outlook. You've got tariff wars, China's stumbling economy, US recession fears. There's not much Australia can do to avoid any external shocks. However, without an agenda to encourage an open economy and productivity growth, the nation faces years of economic stagnation. That would mean fewer opportunities for upward mobility, especially for younger generations and those who don't own assets. So what to do? Well, substantial productivity improvements are still possible, But the regulation of our economy is extraordinary and its impact is colossal. You just take the housing affordability crisis. Now, our chief economist, Peter Tulip, has shown that in our major cities, approximately half the cost of our housing, either buying or renting, it comes from government taxes and regulations. In particular, planning approvals restrict supply, and that just drives up the price. As is often the case, the ones who suffer the most from these barriers to entry, they're the most disadvantaged, the poor and the young. We need to liberalise planning restrictions and allow more building. And then there's the regulatory rules and red tape. Now, our banking, insurance and private wealth sectors, they should be able to fund the risks needed to break the economy out of its subpar growth and lagging productivity. And then there's budget responsibility. Now, our chairman at CIS, Nicholas Moore, he and I made these points in the financial review earlier this year, that when our high terms of trade revert to normal, unless we are more productive, you've got government spending growth that will just blow out deficits even more than currently expected. And then there'll be increased pressure for taxes to increase, there'll be more inflationary pressure in the economy and higher interest rates. And with higher interest rates, our heavy debt burden will seriously impinge on our government's ability to respond to the economic and security challenges, or call them crises, they'll inevitably arise. Now, in any event, increasing debt can only be paid for by productivity growth. So once again, we come back to the same problem. Our future prosperity depends on getting productivity back on track. Now, some problems in life seem impossible to solve, but our productivity problems are of our own making, and our own history shows that we can resolve them. The longer we wait to solve these problems, the greater the cost to all Australians, especially our young and disadvantaged.